some of the backlash against influencers? Do you think there's misogyny involved?
The traditional wine media and the traditional wine industry doesn't really want to change anything. I don't think they think anything is wrong. Before it was the bloggers, now it's the influencers, and they've always hated something new. Anything that's going to change the establishment. The democratization of these platforms has given people who previously didn't have a voice or couldn't get a voice through the traditional means, have made it easier for them to find their tribe and build up influence and build up credibility. There are people who are just taking a pretty photo with a bottle and that may get a lot of likes and a lot of attention. Or is it really wine content? Who cares if it's helping kind of proliferate wine? And I think why not try something different? I think that that's where the backlash comes from. I definitely think it is generational as well. There's some age factors in there in terms of a changing of the guard by generations.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 142. How are podcasts a great way to learn about wine? Which wine books can jumpstart your education about wine and then further it as you get more knowledgeable? And what's behind the backlash against wine influencers on social media? You'll get those answers and more wine tips in our conversation today with Robert Vernick and Peter Yeung, co-hosts of the XChateau podcast. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of our conversation, links to both of my books, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find me on Zoom, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube live video every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/142. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show. So I love sitting at the kitchen island and chatting with Miles as he cooks dinner on Saturdays. One night, he noticed I was watching him intently as he pounded the chicken breast with a mallet, and so he started saying the following. So this breaks down the muscle fibers in the meat, making it more tender. This is important when you have two pieces that are different sizes because they'll cook at an uneven rate, and the thinner piece will dry out and the thicker one will be undercooked. And I said, wait, are you food-splaining to me? And he said, well, just in case you ever want to try making this yourself, hon. So I said, well, I appreciate your good intentions, but I'll always be cooking adjacent. You cook, I pull the corks. That's why we work so well together. Fortunately, Miles is willing to learn about wine, though that's made our lives much more expensive. Okay, on with the show. Robert Vernick and Peter Yeung co-host the XChateau podcast that features insights, analysis, and perspectives beyond winemaking. So they tackle topics like marketing and finance and consumer trends, some really interesting stuff. Robert is a noted wine blogger and holds the WSET diploma. Peter is a business consultant and the award-winning author of Luxury Wine Marketing, and he was named one of Wine Business's 2020 Wine Industry Leaders. I welcome them both now from their homes in San Francisco. Hello, Peter. Hello, Robert.
Hey, Natalie. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So glad you're here. Excellent. All right. So let's kick it off with your first memory of wine. Peter, why don't you talk about your first memory of wine?
I had to actually look through old passports because I asked my dad, like, when did we go to Europe? I don't remember the year. And I'm like, maybe I should know this since, it was my first memory of wine. And then I discovered, I was 10 at that time. We were traveling through Europe with my uncle and his family who were wine and spirits distributors in Singapore. And I barely remember this. I only remember maybe one or two wine tastings, but the one I do remember, I believe it was in Alsace. everyone was tasting wine and were spitting the wine, the adults anyway, not at 10. But I saw my dad, he was tasting the wine and like swallowing. He wasn't spitting. So, I observed that. And so I went over to him and I pinched his stomach and said, "You're doing it wrong." Robert probably knows that I still do that today, to him or my...
Do you pinch Robert's stomach?
Exactly.
Yeah. It's all in good fun. Cool. So that gave you your first memory. How about you, Robert?
So I grew up in a Hungarian-American family, and both my parents worked. And I remember when I'd get sick as a kid, that I would stay with my grandparents, and warm wine was like the cure for everything. And I'm not sure if they just felt like alcohol killed everything, or if it helped you sleep. I don't know, but I remember having warm red wine when I was sick as a kid. It was obviously watered down, but it was just something to kind of like help you sleep and get through like a fever or whatever.
Did it make you feel better, you think?
I don't know. It probably helped me sleep. I'm not sure.
Well, it helps me feel better, but not when I'm sick because I can't smell. But cool. So, Peter, let's move ahead a little bit. What's the first memorable wine that you actually tasted?
Yeah. In college, I actually ordered wine from wine.com, and I was a little bit more into wine, although not like today. I would buy different things, and I bought a Barolo, and I remember being in my room and opening the bottle, and the whole room just like filled with the aroma, and that got me a lot more interested in wine. I still didn't know anything until I took some like wine courses and things, at least a decade later. That was like changed my life in a way, I guess, but it took a long time. And I still enjoy very aromatic Nebbiolos today. And I'm a little distracted even now because, since we're having to drink wine at 8 a.m. for you, Natalie, I did open a Barolo 2013 Odero.
Breakfast of Champions.
Is still there, yeah.
Oh, is it?
The perfume is in my room, and it's like, oh, okay, I can smell it even though it's, a foot or more away.
Isn't it amazing how powerful smell really is? I mean, it's part of why I'm sure we're all into wine, but it just takes you back to those first memories. I mean, it's so intimately connected with memory. That's great, Peter. How about you, Robert? What is your first memorable wine?
I was getting into wine because we'd have it at business dinners and stuff like that. It wasn't until I was doing a startup and the COO of a company that bought mine was Bordeaux, and he found out I was like getting into wine, and he's like, well, you have to try aged Bordeaux. And so he brought a couple bottles from his cellar. I don't remember the exact thing. It was either the late 80s or early 90s, but it was Chateau Gros. And I just remember thinking like, wow, what's going on here? There's like next level, like things that I'm smelling that I've never smelled in a wine. At that point, I probably hadn't had a wine that was that old. So much jumped out of the glass, and I was like, what was going on at that time, at that place to make this wine smell like this now? And where's this bottle been all this time? And all these questions just started going through my head, and it just really kind of like hooked me.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, there is always that one starter wine. You both seem to have been in high tech. Robert, was your startup a high tech venture?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Did you know each other before you came into wine? Did you have this sort of common background?
No. I lived out of the country for a while. I was in China for 12 years, so I did a lot of my stuff there.
Oh, okay. Wow. How did you guys meet, by the way?
We were in some of the classes, and then one of our friends who I was in a tasting group with, I think, invited Robert to join that tasting group. And so we joined, and so we saw each other pretty much every week, blind tasting wines. And yeah, that's how we got to know each other.
Oh, wow. And when did the idea for the podcast come along?
We've been talking about it pre-pandemic. I think we started talking about it in, I don't know, let's see, it's 2021. So we started probably talking like late 2019. We were talking about the idea of a podcast, and, obviously Peter had just written his book, and I think a lot of people didn't understand the space. And I was like, well, I could just interview you. And then he's like, well, I don't know anything about social media, and I could interview you. And so we started talking about that. And then the pandemic hit, and we all of a sudden had a lot more free time because neither of us was commuting anywhere. So we bought some mics and basically decided to do it from our homes.
Wow. And why did you decide on a podcast, say, versus YouTube or some other outlet? Why were you drawn to podcasts?
Look at us.
Who's that?
Face for radio is what I like to say personally about myself. So yeah, okay. So, but you must be drawn to the whole power podcast, the whole thing about, I don't know, there's something about it, isn't there? Like radio, but more on demand, more flexible.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like people are going to podcasts to learn things or find interesting things. And so I think you can capture a unique audience. I think it's very hard to market a podcast. I mean, I think you can use other channels, but there's not necessarily this straight overlap. But I feel like we have fairly active listeners who listen every episode, and we get a lot of feedback from people personally in the industry. Obviously, most of our people are based in the US. So I think there's that. I think there's actually a very strong consumption for the people who do listen. They actually listen to the entire thing.
Wow. What kind of feedback do you get?
Mostly positive. People like certain types of guests. Sometimes people have said they missed the episodes where it's just Peter and myself going back and forth because we do have a lot of guests. Peter, what else have we gotten?
My mom was actually complimentary of one of our more recent episodes. She said my voice was okay, but normally she's a lot more critical. She said some of the episodes early on were too boring and, we needed to have more jokes or things like that. But
Thanks, Mom.
Yeah.
No, moms are invested.
Yeah, I think that's still our sole 4-star review is from my mom.
Oh, okay.
On Apple Podcasts. We also listen to a lot of podcasts, especially for learning about wine. So I listened to for a long time Inside Winemaking and Guild Som and, Levi Dalton's podcast. And it was how I started to study about wine, especially for the Master of Wine program. And so we thought it was natural to do one. And Robert's very on top of all the tech trends. I may be a laggard in that space, and he's one of the forward people there. And so he had identified that, hey, podcast is probably a good idea. We should do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of
Absolutely.
interesting business podcasts that talk about problems in the business space where people actually learn things from. And it was like, there's nothing like that for wine. And like everybody's doing interviews of producers and talking about the production and the actual like making the wine, but no one's talking about like, well, what happens once you make the wine and like getting it into the market and dealing with it. But there are on the business side, there's podcasts about selling your company. Like that's all they talk about is about buying and selling companies.
That specific niche.
Yeah. And so we thought that might be interesting to do something for wine because there's a lot of topics and a lot of people don't have a full grasp of those.
Absolutely. Now, Peter, you were also in high tech. Tell us about that because you were in high tech before you got into wine, but there's still a connection there.
Well, it was more of like clean technology, I guess, but in the Silicon Valley space. So I was always more in like that energy utility world. And when I was a management consultant, I took a sabbatical and studied wine at the Culinary Institute of America, where you're wine tasting every day. It was actually with Karen McNeil. She was the dean at the time. And so we had classes with her, and she's very like, you have to spit, very like
Yes,
structured
imagine.
and like teacher like.
Yes. How many wines were you tasting a day there?
Oh, I don't know, probably at least 20, if not more, because it was literally like 9 to 4, I think.
Wow.
And
That's intense.
this was like a 6-week program. And after a few days, everyone's looking at each other like, oh, we got to go get a beer. I think, right? And then you get over that and you can just start powering through and enjoying it more. And I think that sparked for me what was more of a interest into more of a passion for wine. And so I started building it more and more into my life, even back at McKinsey was a consulting firm I was at. And then, so I saw an opportunity to go into the clean tech space and high tech in Silicon Valley and try to potentially make some money to then screw around in wine or, do something silly that doesn't make a lot of money in wine. And so I made that attempt. Unfortunately, I just recovered the pay cut I took to go there in the diminished valuation IPO, but it was a great experience. And eventually I said, okay, I think it's time. Maybe I should do this wine thing.
Right. Absolutely. And Robert, there are a few books that must have been part of your journey. What were some of the most influential in your learning about wine?
In terms of books, my very first wine book was Kevin Zraly's Windows of the World. I wanted something very clear cut, laid out of like, how do I get into this? How do I approach this? It's a book I recommend to people all the time. I think it's one of those classic kind of like the way I would want to approach wine. Sometimes books approach it from the grape as opposed to the region. And so I really like that approach. And then obviously the book I use the most, I think any person who's actually studying wine is Jancis Robinson, Oxford Wine Companion. I actually use the online version now because you can save things and bookmark things and star things. And I was always I want a physical book, but now I've totally switched to digital for that. Yeah. And it just becomes so much easier because they update it and it's all on the online subscription and you get a discount as a wine student. So it's just something that, I probably use once a week at this point.
Yeah, and things are changing so quickly. I mean, it's kind of why when I decided to teach online wine and food pairing classes, I started online and it's still all online. I haven't moved to physical courses. I mean, I've led wine tastings in the past, but I just find it so flexible. I mean, the number of people you can reach, the updates to the course are continual. I mean, I get it. It's really powerful. So maybe tell us, for each of you, who has been your favorite guest on your podcast so far and why? What was that person's backstory?
I think Ikimi Dubose of the Roots Fund, she's just so dynamic and such a personality. And
What is the Roots Fund? Sorry.
it's a scholarship fund for the BIPOC community in wine.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And she's just such a force, right? And you're both intrigued and intimidated at the same time. There's always new layers of even her own personal backstory. She's like a quarter Chinese, I think. And it's just like, wait, really? And then so it was great. And I think she really taught us about how to be more inclusive and about not inviting people into the same space, but building new spaces as a way of actually getting inclusivity.
Did she give an example of that? Because that's an interesting insight.
I don't know if there was a specific example that I remember, but it was like if you have the same structure and you're just saying, "Oh, sure, you're welcome in," but the structure was built for a certain type of person, then that's not really going to work. And so having something new that is built with a broader, more diverse set of people in mind is a better approach.
And what was her name again?
Ikimi Dubose.
Okay. I must look her up because she sounds really interesting. A potential guest in the future for
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
podcast. Yeah. And Robert, do you have a favorite guest?
Mine's more controversial. I really enjoyed talking with Maureen Downey, who I've chat with a number of other times. I mean, there's so much drama and conspiracy around counterfeiting wine, and it's still going on. And so she gave us the whole lowdown on the Rudy backstory, but also like what's actually happening now still and how bad of a problem it really is. And something that it's kind of victimless crime, or people get fake wine. Ooh, that's not the end of the world. But like people are spending tons of money on these things, and sometimes not. I mean, even there are people who have been counterfeiting Yellowtail. But all these things that like I didn't realize how bad of a problem it really was until talking with her. She's just so energetic, and she's one of those people that people love to love or hate, very polarizing. And
polarizing because she's got great, strong opinions. They call her the wine detective in the world of wine fraud. So I am sure not everyone loves her, especially the counterfeiters. But yeah, was she talking about new technologies? I just wonder, just throw this out there, maybe you haven't explored it, but do you think non-fungible tokens, I think that's right,
NFTs,
will play a part in preventing fraud?
I think on the higher end, yeah, a lot of the counterfeiting stuff is really cosmetic at this point. And then she has a company that is doing a blockchain NFT for wines that puts a chip underneath the capsule, but on top of the cork that can be detected and traced. And so I know a lot of wineries are looking into that and starting to do that. But then right as their business was ramping up, the pandemic hit. So what's it? Shea Consulting, CHAI. Yeah, Shea Consulting is pioneering in that space. So I definitely think it's something that, especially on the very collectible wines, I think people will start to do. I think it'll take a while for that to roll all the way out. And we're probably many years away from that becoming something that's on every bottle of wine or any kind of consumable product. But it's something that I think could be used across any of the foods products, right? Like in terms of tracking where things have been, if they've been in heated areas and things like that, even from yogurt to eggs.
Wow, cool. And then you've had a few unusual moments on your podcast. Tell me about mayonnaise, Peter.
It's something people love to hate. I think it was Paul Yannon of Colangelo and Partners. Maybe this is why people don't interview other parts of the business, like PR people, because they end up saying things like mayonnaise are not interesting.
Mayonnaise, why would
they were talking about marketing or doing PR for mayonnaise? He's like, no one gets about it, goes in, it's like, I want to go help Hellman's like some more mayonnaise.
He was just comparing it to wine, where wine is more interesting, fascinating, has these stories, and he's like, what do you say about mayonnaise, right? And then someone else, I can't remember who it was also hating on mayonnaise during an interview.
It was just boring compared to wine. You don't have a backstory to mayonnaise or whatever. Yeah, okay. And what about influencers in Brazil? There's something about that as well you were talking about.
We did this whole series on wine influencers to talk about the different types of wine influencers, and every single person we talked to in their top 5 kind of like demographics was Brazil. It was just a running joke. And before doing this podcast, I didn't realize how big the Brazilian wine market was or how passionate they were about wine. And now I've paid attention to it. They're out there in force and they're consuming content voraciously.
It started looking at just Robert's demographics because we'd be like, okay, we're doing this. Where are your demographics? And you'd be like, US, France, Italy, whatever. Brazil would show up pretty high on there. And then we would ask all these other influencers. And Brazil was always like number 3 or 4. And we would just be shocked. We're like, really? Oh, okay.
Among your followers.
Yeah. So
it was
6% of my following on Instagram is from Brazil, which is crazy to me.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah. Do the two of you consider yourselves influencers, or what would you call yourselves?
I mean, the one takeaway from our interview is that everybody hates the term influencer.
They don't like it. No.
Yeah, no. So no matter what space you're in. So, I mean, it's kind of a loaded term. It's a term, again, people love to hate.
Why is that?
Because I think there's so many different types of people that have influence. I think the true definition of an influence is like you could go anywhere and bring your people with you. And people like are following you, not what you're doing, and they'll go wherever you're doing things. And so in that regard, I wouldn't consider myself an influencer because like if I just pop up on a new platform, people aren't going to just flock and seek me out. So I think on Instagram, like I am a wine personality or a known wine account, but I wouldn't consider myself like that I can move people from one platform to another. And no matter where the omni-media going to always follow me.
Right. And start talking about shampoo or something. And then they're all using your brand. Yeah. How about you, Peter?
Definitely not. Robert calls me a noob for social media, and I am in some ways. I don't spend a lot of time on it. And I mean, I have some, but depending on how you define the term, I think maybe within the wine trade or industries, I certainly as a consultant to different wine brands or wine businesses, I have influence in some way on what they do, but that's, I think, not the traditional use of the term influencer.
Sure. Some of the backlash against influencers, do you think there's misogyny involved?
I think the traditional wine media and the traditional wine industry doesn't really want to change anything. I don't think they think anything is wrong. I think that they cherry pick the people that are, so, before it was the bloggers, now it's the influencers, and they've always hated something, right? And so they hate something new, anything that's going to change the establishment. So what I think the democratization of these platforms has done is given people who previously didn't have a voice or couldn't get a voice through the traditional means, have made it a lot more easier for them to find their tribe and kind of build up influence and build up credibility with a group of people. So there are people who are just taking a pretty photo with a bottle and that may get a lot of likes and a lot of attention. Is it really wine content? Who cares if it's helping kind of proliferate wine? And I think some people question the level of the content, but I would say that clearly the level of content that has been traditional in the wine industry isn't helping already. So why not try something different? So I think that's where some of the backlash comes from. I definitely think it is generational as well. I think there's some age factors in there in terms of a changing of the guard by generations and how people think about that. And you even see this in other things in terms of like millennials and Gen Z kind of have these like little wars against each other on these different social media platforms over different topics. And so you just have to market and talk to each of these groups in a very different way. But it's not just age. It's also the level that they want to dive into it. I mean, wine is like the deep end of the pool. And some people just want to stay in the shallow end.
Yeah, that's true. But you make some really good points there. Like at first there was like, I don't know if it was 5-10 years ago, but traditional media, and I include myself among those because I've written for magazines and newspapers, but there was a lot of disrespect for bloggers. Now bloggers have almost seemed to become mainstream, and there's very little difference, especially with traditional media dying, like the newspapers and magazines. Everyone's on a blog now, no matter where you came from or what your age is. But I like that parallel that at first it was the bloggers who were getting the short end of the stick, and now it's kind of the influencers, and next it'll be somebody else. But there is an important generational aspect to it beyond misogyny.
Yeah, I mean, going into the misogyny side, like there are a lot more female influencers than there are male ones. Having talked to a number of PR firms, it's just rare for me as a white male to talk to a PR firm. They're like, oh, a male person who talks about wine with a decent following, and like this odd like rarity for them, and it feels nice but awkward at the same time. So
you're a unicorn.
I know. So yeah, I mean, I think there is some of that, but I mean, at the end of the day, I follow people who post kind of awkward things, and then other people who Like, I felt anywhere from collectors to actual, like, people who I'd consider influencers who are really talking about brands and getting out there. But, like, I'm less judgmental of the content. I really care about, like, I mean, I hope they're helping the industry and helping create awareness for wine. Is it going to turn someone from a beer to a wine? Hopefully. I mean, the more wine people are drinking overall in the world, the better it is.
Absolutely. And with hard seltzers like White Claw, who are drinking wine's lunch, if you will, I think we do need multiple points of contact and influence wherever it can be found if the wine category is going to continue to thrive.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Peter and Robert. Here are my top takeaways. Number 1, I enjoyed their insights about how podcasts are a great way to learn about wine. Yes, of course, I'm biased, but I think the depth of information you can get from a podcast is unparalleled compared to social media. Each episode can be like one of those little condensed summary books for when you don't have the time or interest to read the whole thing. That said, I think wine books can jumpstart your education and further it as you get more knowledgeable. Again, I admit to my own bias, having published 2 of them. However, I like Peter and Robert's recommendations for your wine library. And finally, I thought they offered great insights as to what's behind the backlash against wine influencers on social media. It really does point to a changing of the guard in the wine industry, which in turn affects how we learn about wine and new wines to drink. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of our conversation, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, links to both of my books, and where you can find me on Zoom, Insta, Facebook, and YouTube live video every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/142. You won't want to miss next week when we continue our chat with Robert and Peter. In the meantime, if you missed episode 29, go back and take a listen. I chat about wine scandals, fakes, and forgery with Maureen Downey, whom Peter and Robert also interviewed. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
I worked in auctions for many years, and I've been managing private wine collections. And it's not just the crusty old 1960 bottle that we need to worry about, because the current wine fraud that we're seeing is recent vintages, recent releases. So if you think that you don't buy $1,000 bottles and therefore wine fraud doesn't affect you, you're wrong. There's been a lot of Miraval Rosé that's counterfeit. There's more and more Brunello de Montalcino in the $40 range that is coming out as counterfeit. So this really does hit all aspects of the industry. And that is because we have seen such low punishment for those who get caught doing this, that organized crime has gotten into the game. Because if you get caught human trafficking or trafficking drugs, you're going away forever. You get caught counterfeiting wine or selling counterfeit wine, you maybe get a slap on the wrist, if that, literally.
If you liked this episode, please tell a friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the tips that Peter and Robert shared. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine you discovered from a wine influencer. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.